While I mostly talk about tabletop wargaming on this channel, it's actually the newest style of game for me. Like, all the way back in elementary school, I played Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon and a lot of trading card games. And then I've been playing RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons or Pathfinder for about 15 years now. Even though I only got into tabletop wargaming a couple years ago, I went really hard into it, so I feel like I have a lot of experience with those three genres. So here I wanted to compare them, because all three have some stuff that's absolutely amazing about them, and then all three have things that are pretty bad. So the format of this video is I want to go over each style of game, and then go over the positives of it and the negatives of each one. And one last thing before we get started, I feel like board games are kind of the fourth category here, but they are just so varied that it's really hard to come up with a good pro and con list, because every board game is so unique. Like tabletop RPGs, a lot of them are fairly similar, or if you play a trading card game, you kind of know what you're getting into. A board game just isn't like that, so I kind of excluded that from this video. So let's start with tabletop wargaming, since that's what I've mostly dedicated this channel to. This is where you collect actual physical miniatures, and you put them on a big battlefield, and you physically see the battle play out as you play the game. So you'll see your soldiers and your aircraft and your buildings and barricades, and they'll be moving around. It's all stuff you've personally built and painted up. So you've actually built the army that you're playing. Normally there's a lot of measuring distances and looking at stats and rolling dice to see how the battle plays out, but it's very thematic. So for positives, this is a weird one to start with, but it's probably the best of the three systems when you're not playing it. I know, that's a horrible pitch. It's awesome when you're not playing. So what I actually mean by that is there's a ton to do outside of the game itself. Like, for example, there's a ton of people who don't really enjoy the game all that much, but they love building, collecting, and painting the miniatures. So they're mostly into what we call the hobby side of it. Like, I know I personally have spent more time painting miniatures than I have playing Warhammer 40,000. Like, I'd say I've played Kill Team more than I've painted, but it's probably pretty close. And on the hobby side, outside of painting, there's stuff like kit bashing, where you take different model kits and you put them together. So you might put a weapon from one model into the hands of another, or swap heads, or just different parts to make something really unique and cool. So if you like that arts and crafts style stuff, this one's amazing. There's so much you can do. You never even have to actually play the game. And on the more strategic side, you can spend hours and hours coming up with your strategy. Like with the hobby thing, there's probably a lot of people that spend way more time talking about and thinking about wargaming than actually playing it. And I don't mean that in a negative way, like they absolutely love doing it. Not as much on the skirmish side, where you only have a couple models fighting it out, but on the big army side, there's YouTube channels that put out like an hour of content every single day, just going over the strategy of something like Warhammer 40,000 or Age of Sigmar. Another thing that's awesome about miniature wargaming is with your actual miniatures, there are so many different games you can play. Like if you want to do sci-fi or historical or fantasy or something more modern, you can basically do any of those. Then there are games that are really fast and aggressive, or ones that are more stealthy and tactical. So basically anything you want to play you can do. And a lot of these, the core rules are fairly similar, you're just playing in a different environment. In a lot of these games, you can use your miniatures from your other games that you've already bought and just apply a new rule set to them, so that's really fun too. That's called miniature agnostic gaming, and I've been getting kind of into it recently, so I think those are really fun. And the final positive of miniature wargaming I want to talk about is the scale of the game. It's the only thing where you can have these giant epic battles, where you can have like 50 soldiers, planes flying overhead, artillery in the back. You can beat deep striking units, and you actually see it all play out. Like they'll be moving through like a destroyed city. It's so cool to look at. In something like a trading card game, you can have these really cool battles, but they're just cards. You don't really see it happen. And in role-playing games, you can have big epic battles, but typically you're just thinking about it like someone's describing it to you. You don't actually get to see it play out. Like the first time I ever went into a game store and saw a game of Warhammer being played, I immediately was hooked. I knew I wanted to get into that hobby just from seeing somebody else play it. Now let's go into the negatives of miniature wargaming. So let's start off with the painfully obvious one, and the reason I think most people don't get into the hobby, and that is price. So if you're playing a full-scale wargame, let's say Warhammer 40,000, once you buy your miniatures, your paint, your supplies, a way to carry it all, you're probably $500 to $700 in, if not more. Like, if you have multiple armies, or if you have a bunch of selections for the one faction you're playing, I bet you're in over $1,000. So I don't know if this is accurate, but I've heard that the average American does not have $1,000 in their bank account. So having a $1,000 Warhammer army is just not feasible for most people, or even if it's feasible, it's not smart. And besides money, it's very time expensive. If you're painting all your own miniatures, it takes forever to get through. Like, I really like the hobby side of it. I love painting up miniatures, and like building them and everything that goes along with that. But I'm definitely at the point where I wish all my orc boys were just done. I'm kind of sick of painting them. Like, I've been taking like about a month hobby break just because I was painting the same thing over and over and over. Like, hobby burnout is definitely a real thing. I guess disclaimer there, like, I'm excited to go back and start painting them again, but I definitely got where I just needed a break. So a related topic is a lot of people just don't like the hobby side of it. They just don't like the artsy craftsy stuff, or they're bad at it and they don't want to get better. Like, part of the appeal is that you have this awesome looking epic army in front of you. And if you're bad at painting and your stuff just doesn't look good, it's not going to excite you, and that's half the fun. Like, it really does take away from the enjoyment. Like, whenever I play with unpainted or half-painted miniatures, I definitely don't like it as much. And another thing with the badly painted miniatures thing is if your miniatures are bad and you already know they're bad, people are still going to point that out and try to correct you or give you tips that you just didn't ask for. Actually, even if you're awesome, they will still correct you. So having people comment on your paint schemes just isn't fun. Like, you never want someone to tell you how you can get better if you already think it's good, or if you're bad and you're already kind of self-conscious about it. On the hobby side, there are ways around this. Like, you can have someone commission paint your army, where they paint everything for you. But the bad part about that is it's really expensive. And if you get new models for that army, you probably want to go back to the same person, so they all look the same. So, out of the three systems, I would say Miniature Wargaming is the one that's the most difficult to get people into. Because, for one, to play a demo match and actually show them what it's like, you have to have two armies, and a lot of people don't. For something like Kill Team, like one of my favorite games, I have a few, so I can teach them how to play, but that's not always the case. And it's just harder to get people to do the upfront commitment, because there's not really a super cheap way to get somebody into something like Age of Sigmar. Like, for trading card games, you can buy somebody a $30 or $40 starter deck. And for tabletop role-playing, they can just sit in on a session. There's not really an equivalent for miniature wargaming. Like, you could get somebody into skirmish wargaming, but if that's not what you're into, you don't really want to start them down that path. You want them to play the same game you do. So for the final negative here, if you go to a local shop and play, you will basically be locked into 2 to 3 game systems at most. What I mean is they will probably have nights set up, where one night's like Warhammer 40,000 and the other is Bolt Ashen or a historical game or Age of Sigmar, or whatever happens to be popular locally. Once you're involved in the community, you might be able to get them to switch over or try something else. But initially that's really hard to do. Like we said, it's hard to get people to swap systems within miniature gaming. So if you're super into Star Wars and you want to play Star Wars Shatterpoint and nobody else at your shop does, chances are they're not really going to be willing to try it. So once you kind of build up some like social credibility and you start making friends, you can probably talk them into it, but it's kind of hard to do at first. Next up, let's talk about trading card games. So these are games where you have a deck of cards. They typically come in either a pre-made set where they're already ready to play and there's a theme to it, or you can buy booster packs where you don't really know what you're getting. So these cards vary wildly in rarity, price, how powerful they are in the game. So it's a really random collection of stuff. So if you like the idea of there just being thousands of combinations, trading card games are awesome for that. So for something like Magic the Gathering in the Commander format, where there's 100 cards in a deck, my guess is there are hundreds of thousands of combinations you can do. Like, I haven't done the math, but I wouldn't be surprised if that number is actually low. There is just what seems like an endless amount of combinations you can do. And on top of this, there's a ton of different formats you can make your deck actually fit. So you have stuff like a standard modern, is what they call it, where you only play with relatively new stuff. Or you can do a booster pack draft, where everybody has like unopened packs of cards, and you all make decks out of that. So it kind of sees who one gets lucky, but also you can make the best combination on the fly. And then you have stuff like Commander, where it's all unique. You have things where it's like 2v2 setups. You have casual, where you do whatever. So there's a ton of possibilities, and with all those different cards, it's basically endless. So another nice thing is the matches can be really fast, and there's like no setup time. Compared to the other two systems, this is the only one that you and somebody else can kind of impulse be like, hey, let's play a match. And 20 minutes later, you're done. If you wanted to play like an impulse miniature game, you have at least 20 or 30 minutes of actually just setting everything up. And then for role-playing games, you just can't do that at all. So another thing that trading card games have over miniature wargaming is that they can be really affordable. Like right now, Walmart in town for multiple different games has like $30 starter decks. Not that those are typically awesome, but they get you playing. Even the cheapest miniature war game is going to cost you at least like 60, 70 bucks. The final and probably the most fun positive of trading card games is actually opening the packs. So it's kind of the collecting part of it. There's nothing else from the other systems that kind of has that casino experience where you go buy a few dollar pack of cards and it might have a $100 or $150 card in there. So a lot of times the pack will be less value than what you pay for it if you're going to resell everything. But there is that chance you could hit a really, really powerful card. Or like the perfect thing you needed for your deck, but you didn't want to go spend $80 for it. And that's always awesome. Like I said, there's just nothing in the other systems that can really replicate that. So that's always really fun. So on the same note, let's start with the negatives. So this isn't a thing for a lot of people, but trading card games are also the most likely to cause like an addition problem. I've heard a lot of stories about people that will spend way too much money just trying to buy cards, build the perfect deck, hunt for something really rare. Like Magic the Gathering just had a thing with a Lord of the Rings special where there was the One Ring, and it was like a $2 million card. And I bet there were people that spent like their entire life savings chasing that thing. Almost like a lottery ticket. So I know earlier I said that trading card games can be really affordable, like 30 bucks. But they can also be the most expensive. Like, there are a lot of individual cards that are in the like $100 to $200 range pretty easily. And you can build a deck of really, really pricey cards. So it can become really unreasonable. And if you're just collecting it and buying the booster packs constantly on top of that, it can just cost an insane amount of money. It's like hard to explain how much money you can spend on these things. So I'm a major finance nerd, so whatever hobby you're into, just make sure you responsibly budget for it. Like, just don't spend more than you're kind of willing to lose chasing these cards. So I feel like I've just been talking about money for all these negatives, but on that note, I think trading card games have the biggest pay-to-win component of any of these. So there are cards that do the same thing, but are just flat out better than another card. So they cost the same amount of whatever resource, but they just have more power. Or it's the same power, but it costs less resources, and does the exact same thing. And typically what happens is the bad version of it will cost like 50 cents. And the really powerful version of it will cost like $80 or $90. Like, lands in Magic are a really good example. A basic land is literally like 10 cents. a really, really powerful like dual or triple land can be $70 or $80. So some of these cards are just more optimized than other cards. But if you have an unoptimized deck, you could spend like $50 on it, which $50 is a pretty reasonable price point for most people for a really casual hobby. But if that $50 deck goes up against a $500 deck, and they both have the same theme, the $500 deck will just be a ton better. So like I said, it does have like a pay-to-win component. Like, one of my best decks is literally like $40 to make new. Everything's really cheap, just the synergies are all awesome. But it can have that component. And my final negative here is some of these names can be really, really complicated to teach new players. There are just so many mechanics in them. Like, if you brought up a list of every mechanic in Magic the Gathering, it would be unreal. And a lot of times these things combo off of each other, so there may be 10 different cards all in this one combination. And you can just lose track of what's even happening. And then finally, we have tabletop RPGs, or tabletop role-playing games. So the most popular one of these, like the one everyone's heard of, is Dungeons & Dragons. And then there's a lot really similar to it. But there are a ton out there. So in these games, there's a loose set of rules that kind of govern what you can and can't do, that kind of dictate what the world is going to be like and how you interact with it. And then you have the DM, or Dungeon Master. So different rule systems call them different things. I'm going to be saying DM for the sake of this video. But they create this world, and they act kind of like the AI for it. So they're like the person controlling what happens. So it's very, very character and story based. So the number one positive is that the creativity is just amazing. It's basically endless. Like, if you have a good pre-made story, or your DM's really talented, it can be by far the most fun you can have playing a game. Like, the upper limits of what can happen is literally only dictated by the group of people you're playing with. So one thing I love about tabletop role-playing is that homebrewing and coming up with your own stuff is basically just part of the game. Like, if nothing else, at least for the DM. So even if there's something in the game system you don't like, you can just change it. You're not really going to be doing that with a card game as much. It's not like you're playing a match of Yu-Gi-Oh! And you just decide you don't like one of the rules and change it. That typically doesn't happen. And same thing with wargaming. It occasionally can, but it's just not very common. It's like, I love homebrewing my own stuff for Kill Team, but it's a lot more work, and I can only really play that with friends or people who are kind of cool with it. I wouldn't just show up to a shop with strangers and use my own homebrew thing. So along with the creative side, another really nice positive is that the setting can be basically anything you want. Like, just off the top of my head, basically every major fandom I'm really into has some kind of tabletop rule set. Like, one of my favorite things is the Alien franchise, like the Ridley Scott Alien, and it has a really fun miniature game. And I know there's a Witcher RPG. I haven't played that one yet, but I know it's there. And there are more generic ones, like Pathfinder or D&D for fantasy, or something like Starfinder, if you want more of a sci-fi setting. And another nice thing is, if there isn't one, let's say there's not a Warhammer 40,000 RPG, you can take a base name like Starfinder, rename stuff and make some of your own rules, and make it into a Warhammer game. And because you're just playing this game with friends or people at a hobby shop, you can really try to set the tone of the game. So you can tell people not to be really try-hard and do an absolutely optimized, like, combat build. Or you can all agree you want to do more of a chaotic campaign, or more of a, like, lighthearted fun campaign, or just whatever you want to do. So that's really nice, because it's one of the only game systems where you can really, ahead of time, really set the tone for how you want to play it. And I would say this is the cheapest of all three. Like, if you all know the rules, only one person really needs a book or two. So that makes it really easy. All you have to have is like a pencil, paper, and some dice. Like, don't get me wrong, you can make sure everybody has their own book, and you can actually use miniatures or some scenery or whatever, but you don't have to. Like, I've probably spent $100 on the Alien RPG, but you absolutely don't have to do that. And my final positive here is that you can play tabletop RPGs with large groups of people, or at least like weird numbers. A lot of games are pretty restrictive on what the number of people have to be to play it. In these, you can kind of have whatever. Like if you have 3 or 5 or 7 people, no one needs to be left out. Like card games are normally either 2 people, sometimes 3 or 4. If you go more than that, they just kind of break. And then wargaming is almost always 2 people with some exceptions. But if you have 3 people, one person is normally just watching the other 2 play. Like normally you want a pretty consistent group to play the same story ongoing. But if someone new wants to join, you kind of have to come up with like a lame excuse of where they came from, like their character. But it's not that big of a deal. Okay, so on the negatives. You know how it's just saying it's best if you can have a consistent group so they can be going through this ongoing story together. Well, that's where the main negative comes in, which is scheduling. Like, scheduling is the absolute nightmare of any ongoing role-playing campaign. Now, if everybody's in high school or college or has a normal 9-to-5 job, it's not that big of a deal. You can just agree Thursday nights are D&D night. But like for my group, I travel a lot, so I'm out of state a ton, like almost every other week. Then one of my friends works second shift, the other one works like third shift basically, and then the last one just plays video games at his mom's house, but is basically nocturnal, so it's kind of rough. Like we haven't been able to have a consistent ongoing campaign for about a year now, just because nobody is free at the same time. Like I said, not always a problem. Like, if you all work at the same job, same shift, that's super easy. You just meet up after work and play. Or if everybody's in college, you basically will have like every evening free. But I think a lot of people will agree with me here. There are times where it's just really hard to get the group together and consistently play. Another potential negative is everybody has to be on the same page. And if they're not, it can really be awkward. Like if half the group wants to do a really serious fantasy, like Save the Kingdom campaign, and the other half just want to goof around and basically do the memeiest thing they can, they're going to butt heads, and it's going to be awkward in person and in the game. And personalities matter way more in tabletop RPGs than they do the other 2 game systems. Typically, if you're playing a match of either a war game or a trading card game, and you don't really like your opponent, you just kind of make it through that match, say, nice game, and then move on. But because a lot of times the tabletop role-playing games are ongoing, or they last hours and you're talking the entire time, acting out characters, those characters take on traits of the person playing them. So if there's personality clashes, they show up way worse here. And you will probably have to deal with them week after week after week. Unless your group collectively decides to awkwardly kick them out, you probably just won't even enjoy playing. So there's one more negative, and if you're not the DM, there's not much for you to do outside of the actual game itself. And as nerds, we like to be able to nerd out over our hobbies for endless hours. You don't really have that opportunity here. Like you could potentially do some modeling where you're actually playing with miniatures if everybody else is, but that's not always the case, and there's only so much you can do there. You're just kind of role-playing while you're there. Some people really like this, others want more to do. Now on the other side, if you are the DM, and you want hours crafting a story, that's awesome, you'll really enjoy it. You will seriously have an endless amount of work you can put into this if you want to. You could come up with a backstory for every single person in a town, know everything about them, know every street, every building on that street. You can get really, really into it if you want to. But you have to accept you are going to be putting in far more work than anybody else. And if you put in that work and they're just not that into it, or they think it's dumb, it's really hard to not take that personally. I've seen it before where a DM will pour their heart and soul into a campaign, and then just nobody else cares. And it's kind of heartbreaking for them. It's kind of sad to see, honestly. It can understandably be very upsetting if nobody else likes it. So out of these three, which one should you play is just kind of whichever one sounds appealing to you. Most people will know if they think the role-playing actually sounds like fun or not, or if the crazy strategy of a trading card game appeals to them, or if they would like the hobby side of miniature wargaming. So I know I spent a lot of time going over the negatives of these, but for most of them it's stuff you can overcome. Like there will be some kind of workaround for it. Like for the price of trading card games. Like I said, my best deck is like $40. Or in that case, if Magic the Gathering is too complicated, you can play something like Pokemon that's simpler. Like there's a lot of other trading card games out there. They might not be as popular as those two, but there are ones that are easier to play. Or if you really like the hobby side of the miniature wargaming, but you're a little more budget restricted, you can play something like Kill Team where it's like $60 a team or $70, so it's not nearly as bad. And then you can go to a hobby shop and use all of their supplies, so you really only had to like paint up your actual team. So like I said, I know I talked about the negatives a lot. I don't want that to discourage anyone. I just think people should be aware of what they're getting into and what the potential pitfalls are. So hopefully that helps you decide. If you have any questions about these, like I said, I have quite a bit of experience in all three. So let me know down in the comments. Thank you for watching.